Hey friends, welcome to Haunted Bedtime. Before we get started, just a quick note. There are only a few ads during the first 15 minutes, and after that, it's completely ad-free. Just you and me. If you enjoy the calm vibes here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely feels right to you. And I'd really love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Share it in the comments. It's always amazing to see how this little community connects people all around the world. I once spent time in a peaceful country town in the mid-north of South Australia, left of a place called Kapunda. It was the kind of town where time moved slowly, where people waved at one another from their porches, and where each tree-lined street seemed to have its own quiet story to tell. On one of those wide, shaded terraces stood an old return veranda bungalow. The house had stood there since the late 1800s, proudly holding its place as the town around it changed. Its charm was undeniable. A mix of stone walls, wooden trims, and verandas that wrapped around like comforting arms. That house wasn't just a structure of bricks and timber. It was a living memory, filled with voices, footsteps, and stories passed through generations. The people who lived there before were warm, hard-working country folks. I knew their daughter Anne for more than 3 decades. She was like a sister to me, and her family felt like my own. We had shared so many seasons of life together, celebrating joyful milestones and comforting each other through painful losses. Before Anne's family moved into that house, it had been home to 2 elderly spinsters. These women, as the town's elders told it, lived quiet lives. They had divided the house into 2 separate parts and lived surrounded by darkness, drawing heavy curtains that blocked out the sun. That was in the time before the Second World War. Both women passed away in the house, their lives ending naturally, quietly, just as they had lived. The original builder of the house, long before the old women and Anne's family lived there, had been a neurosurgeon, a doctor who operated on the brain. He had designed the house with a specific purpose in mind. In the 3-roomed cellar beneath the house, he had built his operating theater, complete with a few hospital beds for recovery. His consulting room sat directly above the cellar, and it was eventually transformed into 2 bedrooms and a long, walk-in storage room at the end of the hall. Anne's father and brother later sealed off the cellar entirely. It had been accessible from the back veranda. Anne once told me that when she was a young girl, she was allowed to run up and down the stone steps, but was never permitted to go past the old, heavy door at the bottom. She remembered peeking through into the darkness, where she saw iron beds lined up, old pots and pans stacked together, and piles of yellowing papers. Eventually, the cellar was filled in with rubble and stones, and the veranda floor above it was rebuilt. That part of the house was later enclosed to make room for the kitchen and laundry. Over time, the house was restored to its original layout. The modifications made by the spinsters were undone, returning it to the vision the doctor had long ago. Anne's parents loved working in the garden. They planted roses that bloomed in deep shades of red and pink, laid out green lawns, and grew fruit trees that filled the air with sweet fragrances. It was a half-acre block, large enough to feel like your own little piece of countryside. The house seemed to breathe, its old bones settling in comfort, surrounded by beauty and care. Whenever my husband and I visited, we stayed in what used to be the doctor's consulting room. It was a bright, welcoming space with 2 doors, one leading to the main hallway and another opening into the back lobby. Between those doors stood a tall cedar wardrobe that smelled of aged wood and memories. In one corner was a small black fireplace that no longer worked, though it added character to the room. A tall window looked out onto a gravel courtyard, where a trellis leaned gently against the side fence. On warm days, the sunlight would pour into the room, lighting it up in a soft, golden glow. Anne and I often spoke about the house and its long history. Her parents were relaxed and open about its past, never brushing aside any questions. During long summer visits, we'd spend our days wandering through nearby vineyards or browsing antique shops. At night, we'd sit in the kitchen, cracking open crabs for supper and laughing into the early hours, our voices echoing through the old rooms. But life, as it tends to do, changed. Dark clouds drifted into our once joyful lives. I lost my husband of 15 years, and everything seemed a little quieter, a little heavier. Yet I continued to spend time with Anne. Our bond remained strong, perhaps even stronger in the face of sorrow. One particular night stands out more than any other. I had retired to bed earlier than usual. It was around 10:30 p.m., and I hadn't been drinking wine that evening. I was simply too tired from a demanding week. The room was warm, so I lay on my back with the sheet pulled halfway up my body. My arms rested outside the sheet, and although it was the warmer side of the house, I didn't open the window. I just wanted rest. I wasn't asleep, not quite. It was that hazy state between dreaming and wakefulness, where your body is heavy, but your thoughts drift freely. As I lay there, eyes closed, I thought I smelled the sweet, thick scent of damask roses, but there were no flowers in the room. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Distinct, sharp steps, like leather-soled shoes tapping gently against wood. There was also the sound of fabric swishing, like someone in a long skirt brushing past the walls. My door slowly creaked open, fully, not just a crack. Two figures entered the room. I could feel their presence close to the side of my bed. One was a man dressed in a dark three-piece suit. He had a gray beard, neatly trimmed. Beside him stood a woman dressed like a nurse from another era, early 1900s perhaps. She wore a black dress with a long white apron, and her sleeves were cuffed up to her elbows. She held a tall glass lamp that flickered slightly as she moved. The man looked at me and then turned to her, saying, "She's done this before." There was something eerie in the way he spoke, something that made me feel I wasn't supposed to be there. I felt frozen, unable to move or even blink. I tried to convince myself that I was dreaming, but deep down I knew I wasn't. I couldn't wake up. I couldn't even cry out. At that moment, it felt like I had died. My thoughts spiraled, and I remember praying that they wouldn't perform an autopsy on me, as if I was watching the scene not from the bed, but from above, from the top of the wardrobe. Everything seemed so still, so real yet removed. The woman leaned over me. Her face was calm, her skin smooth. She looked to be in her early 30s. She placed the lamp gently on the night table beside the bed and asked the man, "What do I tell the master? He's home." The man replied, "I'll speak with him," and turned to leave the room. The woman then pulled the sheet up over my face. I could smell the strong, clean scent of borax, a strange thing to notice in such a surreal moment. And yet, I didn't feel fear. I felt unnaturally calm, almost as if I had accepted something beyond my control. Then she walked over to the window, opened it, and quietly left the room. The breeze that drifted in was warm. The curtains moved gently, brushing against the wooden floor. Everything looked peaceful. The room was neat. There was no luggage, no clutter, just stillness. I woke in the early hours of the morning. The sheet had been pulled up over my face. The window, which I had left shut, was open. The door, which had been slightly ajar, now stood wide open. I sat up, confused, heart pounding. The hallway had a carpeted floor, and my room had a large floral carpet square with only a narrow strip of polished floorboards around the edge. But there had been no sound, no one coming or going. No lamp was on the night table, and yet the faint scent of damask rose still lingered in the air. Feeling disoriented and a little shaky, I got up, slipped on my silk robe, and walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I needed something cold, something real. I needed to anchor myself back to the world I knew. To my surprise, Anne was already in the kitchen. She looked just as restless as I felt. This wasn't unusual. She often wandered the garden at night when she couldn't sleep. We were both responsible professionals, carrying the weight of many things in life. I told her about what had happened. I didn't leave anything out, and she didn't doubt me for a second. She told me that she often heard voices coming from the fireplaces and vents, especially when she was home alone. These vents, she reminded me, were all connected to the old cellar. She said she'd long felt a presence in the house, something quiet, something watching. Later that day, as the sun warmed the lounge room, we both dozed off on the couch. By lunchtime, we were awake again and ready to face what had happened. We sat with Anne's parents and talked openly about the experience. They weren't surprised, not even a little. Anne's mother, a devout Christian, reminded me gently that nothing evil would harm me. She said their faith and their love protected their home, and I believed her. Their kindness was deep and sincere. They had taken me into their hearts and into their home during a difficult time in my life. I wasn't afraid, not really, but I did wonder, had I imagined it? Was my mind trying to process my grief through strange dreams? Could it have been a memory from a past life? Or maybe a message, some kind of spiritual warning from the past or future? Years have passed since that night. Anne has moved far away, and sadly, her parents and brother passed away, all in the same year. The house was sold, and one day I drove past to see what had become of it. The once warm, welcoming home was now painted entirely black. The lawn was dry and lifeless. The beautiful garden Anne's parents had nurtured for so long had withered into dust. Palms now sat awkwardly on the front veranda, like they didn't belong. But no matter how the house looks now, I will never forget it. More importantly, I will never forget Anne or her family. They left a mark on my life that I'll always carry. I truly believe that people come into our lives for a reason, and sometimes their presence changes us forever. My life is brighter now, happier. New chapters have begun, old ones have closed. That is the way of life. A beautiful, mysterious tapestry woven from the people we love, the things we see, and the stories we live. I was born in a communist country in Europe, in a gray concrete city, where most buildings looked the same, and almost everything in life felt controlled and planned by someone else. We lived in a small apartment in a tall block of flats, the kind that lined the streets like identical boxes stacked up toward the sky. Life was strict, food was rationed, and adults always seemed worried about something. As a child, I didn't fully understand politics, but I could feel the heaviness in the air, in people's voices, and in the way they spoke in whispers about the government when they thought no one was listening. When I was 6 years old, everything in my small world shifted. My mother divorced my father, and we moved out of his place. I still remember the day we left, my mother packing our few belongings into old suitcases, her movements sharp and focused, her face tired but determined. I didn't really understand why my parents were separating. I just knew that my father would no longer be there when I woke up, and that felt strange and confusing. We left his apartment and went to live with my mother's mother, my grandmother. My grandmother lived on the 8th floor of another tall, gray building. The stairwells smelled like dust and old cooking, and the elevator sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. From the small balcony, you could see rows and rows of similar blocks, each filled with families trying to get by. Inside the apartment, everything was old but clean. The walls were faded, the furniture heavy and dark. My grandmother was strict, serious, and to my young mind, not very warm. I didn't feel close to her the way I did to my father's mother, who had always been kind, gentle, and soft-spoken. My paternal grandmother would hug me, bring me little treats, and speak to me with patience. With my mother's mother, it felt different, colder, more distant, and I reacted to that in the worst possible way. As a little child, I was restless, stubborn, and often unkind to my grandmother. Looking back now, I can see how cruel I was, but at the time, I didn't understand the weight of my actions. I remember throwing towels out of the window from the 8th floor and watching them float and twist in the wind as they fell down to the ground. I knew my grandmother would have to go all the way downstairs and pick them up. I knew it was wrong, and that was exactly why I did it. It was as if I wanted to test her, to punish her for not being the grandmother I wished she was. Sometimes I would bite her on the arms, hard enough that black and blue bruises would form in perfect little circles. I can still picture the marks, dark, round, and ugly on her pale skin. She would wince and pull her arm back, but she rarely yelled at me the way some adults might shout at a misbehaving child. She would just look at me with this mixture of pain and confusion, and I would turn away, pretending not to care. It wasn't that I didn't know the difference between right and wrong. Even then, part of me knew what I was doing was bad. But there was some strange, childish anger inside me, some frustration I couldn't name, and I took it out on her. Some months after we moved in with her, My grandmother suffered a stroke. One day she was moving around the apartment as usual, and not long after, she was different. The stroke left her with difficulty speaking clearly. Words that had once come out smoothly now stumbled and broke apart. Her sentences became strange, her sounds twisted. To a child, it was almost like listening to someone trying to speak underwater. Instead of feeling compassion, I used her weakness against her. I would tease her for not being able to speak properly. When she tried to talk, I would mimic the way her words came out, exaggerating the mispronunciations and laughing at her in front of her face. I would copy her speech patterns on purpose, turning them into a cruel joke. She could hear me and see me, and I knew she understood exactly what I was doing, but she couldn't respond the way she might have before. She didn't have the strength or clarity to defend herself with words. She had a wood fire stove in the apartment. It was one of those old metal stoves, dark and solid, with a small door in front where wood was fed in. Around the apartment, I would find dry cell batteries, those small cylindrical ones that were used in some of our devices. I began throwing them into the fire, just to see what would happen. They would heat up, sometimes pop or crack, making small explosions that startled her. I knew it scared her. I also knew that, because of her speech, she could no longer complain clearly to my mother about what I was doing. In my childish mind, that meant I could get away with anything. Even at that young age, there were moments when regret would wash over me. Sometimes, after biting her or teasing her, I would sit quietly and feel a small ache of guilt in my chest. I would glance at her, seeing her tired eyes and slow movements, and I would know I had gone too far. But for some reason, that guilt was never strong enough to make me stop. It was like there was a wall between what I felt and what I did. I kept repeating the same behaviors, as if some dark corner of me enjoyed the power I had over someone who could not defend herself. Sometime later, my grandmother suffered a second stroke. This one was worse. It put her in the hospital permanently. I remember the hospital visits clearly. We would go there as a family. My mother, my uncle, my aunt, my cousins, and me. The hospital was cold and smelled like disinfectant. The walls were a pale color, and everything felt quiet, controlled, and slightly frightening. We would walk down long corridors with our footsteps echoing, then step into her room, where the world seemed to shrink down to her bed and the machines around her. My grandmother lay there, thinner and weaker than before, unable to speak at all this time. I remember standing at her bedside, staring at her face, feeling something heavy inside me. I thought it might be my fault. In my childish logic, I told myself that my behavior, the teasing, the biting, the constant troubling, had helped push her toward this second stroke. I didn't know anything about medicine, but guilt doesn't care about facts. It simply attaches itself and grows. Every time I saw her in that hospital bed, a voice inside me whispered, "This is because of you." Despite everything I had done to her, every cruel act, every nasty word, my grandmother never looked at me with hate. She would watch me with soft, kind eyes. Even though she could not speak anymore, she would slowly reach out her hand toward me. Her pale, thin fingers would search for mine, and when I placed my hand in hers, she would hold it gently. There was no anger there, no sign of resentment, only a quiet, deep affection that I did not deserve and did not know how to handle. In 1986, my mother, my stepfather, and I emigrated to Brisbane, Australia. I was 11 years old. Leaving Europe felt like stepping out of a dark, heavy room into fresh air and sunlight. The journey itself was long and overwhelming. Different languages, different faces, and finally a new country where the light seemed brighter, the sky wider, and everything felt unfamiliar but hopeful. Our new home was a relatively new 3-bedroom housing commission house. It wasn't fancy, but to us it was safe, clean, and full of possibilities. Australia felt like a completely different world from the one I had left behind. The climate was warmer, the people more relaxed. My new school had friendly teachers who smiled genuinely and treated me kindly, even though I was still adjusting to the language and culture. The other children seemed curious, open, and welcoming. They didn't look at me like I was strange, even though I was the foreign kid with a strong accent and a different past. I made new friends. I learned new words. The routines of daily life in this new place slowly began to cover the memories of my old life, like fresh paint on an old wall. As the months passed, my memories of my grandmother and of the guilt I felt toward her sank deeper and deeper into my mind. I told myself I had left all that behind. Whenever my thoughts drifted back to my childhood apartment, the hospital, or her kind eyes, I pulled my mind away and focused on the present. In my everyday life in Brisbane, it was easy to pretend that my past was a closed chapter. I believed that, as far as my grandmother was concerned, I had stopped thinking about her. I thought that part of my story was over, but the human mind doesn't truly forget what it has not resolved, and the heart does not simply erase those it has wronged. It was early in 1987. I was living in Australia, and my life seemed happy and full. I was excited about my new surroundings, and for the first time in a long time, felt like my future could hold something bright. I had become used to the layout of our house, the feel of my room, the color of the walls, the way the light came in through the window in the mornings. I was always an early riser. One morning, just like many others, I awoke before everyone else in the house. The air was still and quiet. There was no sound from the kitchen, no movement from my parents' room, no birds yet calling outside. I opened my eyes slightly and turned my head, and that was when I saw her. Standing a few feet away from my bed was my grandmother. She looked exactly as I remembered her from Europe, back when she could still walk around and move by herself. Only now, she seemed different. Her entire form had a kind of white tone to it, like she was made of pale light, yet she was clearly solid enough for me to see her face, her clothes, her outline. She did not glow in a dramatic way. She simply looked like a faded photograph brought to life. Her expression was calm, not frightening. Her eyes, the same eyes that used to search for my hand in the hospital bed, were fixed on me. I did not scream. I did not feel the kind of terror you might expect. Instead, I felt a deep sense of surprise and a strange, quiet stillness inside. It was as if time had paused. My body felt frozen, but not in fear, more in disbelief. I just stared at her, trying to understand how she could possibly be there, in my new bedroom, in a country so far away from where she lived and died. She looked at me with the same kindness she always had. Then, in a clear voice, she spoke to me. Her words were simple, but they cut straight through me. She said, "Don't you remember me, Camcho?" She used my name the way she used to. She spoke as if she had always been able to speak clearly, as if there had never been a stroke. Her voice was gentle, familiar, and filled with something I can only call love. Before I could answer, before I could move or even reach out my hand, she vanished. It was as sudden as turning off a light. One moment she was standing there, solid and real, and the next moment, the space where she had been was empty. My room was just a room again, with its plain walls and simple furniture. I lay there in my bed, still as a bird, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I wasn't sure how long I stayed like that, staring at the spot where she had been. The world outside the window slowly began to wake up. Somewhere in the house, I heard faint movement, the normal sounds of morning returning, but I felt changed. Right then and there, I made a decision. I swore to myself that I would never tell anyone what had just happened. Not my mother, not my stepfather, not my friends. No one. I told myself that if I kept it inside, maybe it would stay unreal, like a secret dream. I was afraid that if I said it aloud, people would think I was crazy, or worse, that I was making it up. But inside, I knew it had been real. The next morning, something arrived that made everything even more clear. We received a letter in the post from my uncle, my mother's brother, still living back in Europe. My mother opened it, and inside was my grandmother's death certificate. The document stated that she had died some weeks earlier. She had died before I saw her. The timing struck me deeply. While I had been living my new life, forgetting about her, she had passed away in a hospital bed far from me. And yet, in this quiet room in Australia, on an early morning, she had come to visit me. She had not scolded me. She had not looked angry. She did not mention my cruel behavior as a child, the teasing, the biting, the way I had used her weakness against her. She only asked one question. "Don't you remember me?" It was not a question to accuse me. It was a question to remind me. A reminder that no matter how far I traveled, no matter how much I tried to bury my past, she was still part of my life. part of who I was. She came not as a shadow of guilt, but as a quiet, loving presence that refused to be erased. I kept my promise. For a long time, I didn't tell anyone. I carried the memory inside me, along with the guilt and the strange sense of peace her visit had brought. Her last act toward me, even after death, was the same as it had been in the hospital. A gentle reaching out, asking nothing but to be remembered. That moment shaped me more than I admitted at the time. Somewhere inside, I learned that what we do to others, especially those who are weak and kind, does not simply disappear. The past has a way of returning, not always to punish, but sometimes to give us a chance to understand, to feel, and maybe to change. I will never forget seeing her in that room, in that faraway country, white and quiet and kind, asking me softly if I remembered her. These experiences are not mine, but my mother's. They happened during the time she was sent to work in a part of the hospital called the Kookaburra Wing, also known as the Old Wing. By the time she started working there, the main events from our old house on the hospital grounds had already passed. We had moved out about 2 years earlier, but the place still carried its own strange stories. A male nurse had moved into the house after us, but he only stayed for about 2 months. He left in a hurry, saying that whatever was in that house had become violent. After that, the house stood empty for about 10 months. No one wanted to live there. Eventually, it was torn down along with around 20 other staff houses to make room for a new complex with 4 modern wings. What happened in that new building is another story on its own. The Kookaburra Wing was different. It was an old 5-story structure that had once been the heart of the hospital's fight against tuberculosis. It held the morgue, with its cold rooms and a long underground tunnel that led to the old cremation building. The place had history thick in its walls. Decades of sickness, pain, and death echoed quietly in the corridors. People said the building never truly slept. Even when the lights were dimmed and the last patients on the newer wards were resting, the old wing seemed to have a life of its own. In the days when tuberculosis was rampant, the Kookaburra Wing had been both a hospital and a morgue for TB patients. People came there hoping for treatment, and many of them never left alive. Over time, staff began to talk about a particular presence in the building, a spirit that seemed to belong there the way old furniture belongs in an old room. The main spirit of the old wing was said to be that of a nurse who had once worked there and died in the hospital from TB herself. Unlike the usual ghost stories that are full of terror and malice, this nurse was different. She was not seen as a dark or evil presence. In fact, most of the staff didn't mind having her around at all. She was known to help more than she harmed. She didn't spend her time slamming doors or frightening people for fun. She was more like an extra, unseen nurse on duty, quiet, watchful, and sometimes surprisingly helpful. I saw her myself twice. Both times, I was younger and visiting. She looked like an ordinary nurse from another era. A crisp white dress, a hat with a red cross, a calm face, and a gentle smile. She did not float or glow or do anything dramatic. She simply walked past, glanced at me, gave me a small knowing smile, and went on her way as if she had charts to check and patients to see. Each time I felt a chill, but not fear. It was more like standing near something sad and kind, something that had been there for a long time. Across the building, different people had their own experiences. Nurses on night shift would hear footsteps in the corridors, the soft squeak and rumble of trolleys being pushed, or the faint metallic clink of instruments being moved. Sometimes they heard the creak of bed wheels, as if someone was pushing a bed down the hallway. Doctors, cleaning staff, kitchen workers, anyone who stayed late or started early would report the same kinds of sounds. They were the everyday noises of a busy hospital. Walking, moving beds, pushing trolleys, voices in the distance. But the strange part was that these sounds almost always happened late at night, long after visiting hours were over, at times when no one should have been moving patients or pushing trolleys anywhere. The old building also had another eerie signature. people often heard the sounds of distressed patients coming from the top floor. Moans, cries, voices calling out for help, or just low, pained sounds of suffering. The unsettling thing about this was that no patients were housed on that top floor anymore. It had been converted entirely into office space. There were desks, cabinets, and paperwork up there, not beds. Yet over and over, people heard the echoes of patients that no longer existed. In the middle of all this, my mother worked her shifts like any other nurse. She was experienced, practical, and not easily scared. She had seen a lot in her career, including death and tragedy, so she was not someone who jumped at every shadow. But even she had 2 experiences in the Kookaburra wing that stayed with her for years. These happened on 2 different nights, involving 3 different patients, and even now they are hard to explain with normal logic. The first event took place on a Saturday night shift, on one of the wards in the old wing. My mother was working with another nurse that night. They were looking after several elderly patients, including 2 women with advanced dementia. These 2 women shared a room with 4 beds in total, but only 2 of the beds were occupied. Both patients were in very poor physical condition. They could not walk or move independently. To get anywhere, they had to be lifted into wheelchairs or shifted carefully from one position to another. Standing up, walking, or climbing out of bed by themselves was completely out of the question. One of these patients had a plastic sheet on her bed. Because she had lost all control of her bowel and bladder, the plastic sheet was there to protect the mattress. It was a part of her daily care and had been in place for a long time. The other woman did not have a plastic sheet on her bed. Their beds, their routines, and their positions in the room were all familiar and predictable. At some point during the night, the nurse working with my mother went into the room to check on them. She made sure they were comfortable, that nothing was tangled or out of place, and then she left the room. Everything was normal. The patients were in their beds, just where they were supposed to be. After this, the nurse returned to the nurse's station, where my mother was sitting. The 2 of them sat together, doing their paperwork, chatting quietly, and keeping an eye on the buzzer panel. It was a typical night shift atmosphere. Dim lights, quiet hallways, tired bodies, and a mixture of boredom and alertness. In the room with the 2 dementia patients, there were 4 beds. 2 were occupied, 2 were empty. On the wall near each bed was a call button. The buzzer patients could press if they needed help. In older buildings, these buttons often had wiring problems. Sometimes they triggered on their own, giving false alarms. Because of that, when the buzzer suddenly lit up for one of the empty beds, my mother and the other nurse were not surprised. Faulty buzzers were something they had learned to live with in the old wing. Still, just to be sure everything was fine, my mother decided to get up and check. She walked down the corridor, pushed the door open, and stepped into the quiet room. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. The 2 patients had swapped beds. The woman who had always been in the bed with the plastic sheet was now lying in the bed without the plastic sheet. The woman who had never had a plastic sheet was now in the bed with one. The covers had been pulled up around them as if someone had settled them improperly. They were lying there the way long-term patients do, comfortable, still, clearly not in the middle of scrambling out of bed or dragging themselves around. For a moment, my mother simply stared. She went over to each patient. Both women still had advanced dementia. Both were in the same frail physical condition as before. Neither of them could walk or even stand, let alone get out of bed, cross the room and climb into another bed. It was completely impossible for them to have done this without help. Yet, my mother and the other nurse knew that neither of them had moved the patients. She checked the hallway, wondering if perhaps another staff member had come in and moved them without saying anything. No one was there. Back at the nurse's station, the other nurse confirmed she had not moved them and had been at the station the whole time. My mother knew that proper protocol required at least 2 nurses to move a patient like these women, and usually a 3rd person if needed. There was no way one person had secretly slipped in and swapped them alone. And if a team had done it, they would have known. Still, they had to deal with the situation somehow. They discussed what to do and decided that since they couldn't safely move the patients back to their original beds by themselves, they would move the beds instead. It was easier to push the beds across the floor than to lift the patients from one bed to another. So they moved the beds around until each patient was once again on the correct side of the room, with the right equipment and arrangements. They decided that when the day shift arrived, my stepfather and 2 other nurses would help them formally reposition the patients if needed and check everything over. They returned to the nurses' station, unsettled but trying to stay calm. Half an hour passed. The building was quiet. Then, once again, the buzzer light came on, for the same empty bed as before. This time, there was something tense in the air. My mother felt it as she stood up. She went back down the hallway, pushed open the door, and stepped into the room. The patients had swapped beds again. Once more, the woman who should have had the plastic sheet under her was in the wrong bed, and the other woman was in her place. Again, they were lying calmly, tucked in, clearly not in distress. Again, there was no one else around, no sounds of movement before she entered, no explanation at all for how these nearly immobile women had changed places. My mother's mind raced, trying to find any kind of logical explanation. Perhaps they had been mistaken earlier. Perhaps there was confusion about which woman had which bed. But no, that was not possible. The plastic sheet was unmistakable. The routines were long established. My mother and the other nurse knew their patients well. There was simply no normal explanation that made sense. Feeling shaken, my mother decided to leave the patients where they were. She backed out of the room, closed the door gently, and returned to the nurses' quarters. She spent the rest of the night shift there, going back only for the necessary checks, but refusing to stare too long at the beds again. Part of her wondered if she was losing her mind. Part of her knew she had seen exactly what she had seen. The story later spread quietly among some of the staff, and no one could truly explain it. Some shrugged it off as a strange glitch of memory. Others looked at the old wing with a new kind of respect, feeling that something there was more active than they had imagined. The second event happened about 5 months later, again during one of my mother's shifts at the Kookaburra wing. This time it involved a different patient, a woman who was well known to the staff. This patient was difficult, demanding, and constantly complaining. She always had something to say about the food, the staff, the temperature, or her bed. She liked to press her buzzer, over and over and over. If she had her way, a nurse would be at her bedside every few minutes. It wasn't that she didn't need care. She did. She was overweight and unable to get out of bed on her own, even to go to the toilet. But she also enjoyed attention and had developed a habit of pressing the buzzer for every minor discomfort or irritation. Eventually, the staff realized that if they left the buzzer with her, it would never stop ringing. It would also take attention away from other patients who genuinely needed urgent help. So they made a practical decision. They took the buzzer away from her. It wasn't done out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Instead of relying on her to call them constantly, they set up a routine to check on her every hour. That way, they could still make sure she was safe and cared for, but the entire ward would not be controlled by the constant ringing of one patient's finger on a button. As they sometimes joked among themselves, they checked on her to make sure she was still alive and complaining. On this particular Wednesday night, my mother was on shift again. Around 10 p.m., she went into the patient's room for one of the regular checks. The woman was sleeping. Her face looked relaxed, her breathing steady. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. My mother made sure everything was in place, the bed rails, the blankets, the equipment, and then quietly left the room and returned to the nurse's station. The night moved on. The hours between midnight and dawn are always the longest for nurses. The world feels quieter and shadows stretch longer. At around 4 a.m., something happened. The buzzer panel lit up. The buzzer that went off was the one that should have been connected to that same patient's bed if the buzzer had still been plugged in. As far as my mother knew, that buzzer had been disconnected and physically removed from the patient's reach. There should have been no way for that specific signal to go off. Seeing it lit up, my mother assumed someone must have plugged the buzzer back in during the shift without telling her. Perhaps a nurse from another ward had decided the woman needed it again. It was the only explanation that made sense in that moment. So my mother got up and walked down the hallway toward the patient's room. As she got closer, before she even reached the doorway, she heard the woman shouting, "Get me off this bloody thing! It's hurting my behind!" the patient screamed. Her voice was loud, angry, and filled with pain. My mother hurried into the room, confused. She was sure the woman had not been on a bedpan when she last checked. Yet when she walked in, the patient was furious, complaining at the top of her lungs. She claimed she had been left sitting on a bedpan for an hour. She was overweight and completely unable to get out of bed on her own, so if she was on a bedpan now, someone had put her there. My mother approached the bed and gently lifted the woman to check. There, underneath her, was indeed a bedpan. It was real, solid, and had clearly been used. My mother carefully removed it, doing what she needed to do as a nurse. Then she asked the question that burned in her mind. "Who put you on the bedpan?" she asked. The woman glared angrily and replied without hesitation. "The nurse in the white dress with the red cross on her hat. Bring her in here so I can give her a piece of my mind." For a moment, my mother simply stared at her. A nurse in a white dress with a red cross on her hat. No one on staff wore that uniform anymore. The current nurses wore navy blue shirts with white spots and black slacks. That was their standard uniform. White dresses with red crosses belonged to an earlier time, to the days of the TB hospital and its long-forgotten wards. My mother later shared this with a few trusted colleagues. Together they came to the same silent conclusion. The woman had likely been visited and helped, though not gently, judging by her complaints, by the same nurse that staff believed still walked the old wing, the nurse who had died of TB in that hospital, the one I had seen smiling twice, the one who seemed to move through the building, doing her own mysterious rounds. The Kookaburra wing still stands today, though it no longer functions as a hospital ward. It is used only as offices now. Files have replaced beds, desks have replaced lockers, and computers sit where once there were trays of medicine. Still, people who work there say that at night, when most staff have gone home and the corridors are quiet, the building does not feel empty. They still hear sounds as if it were a working hospital. Distant footsteps, the roll of invisible trolleys, the creak of beds that no longer exist, and faint echoes of voices from floors that house only offices on paper. The morgue is still in use. Bodies come and go, the cold rooms remain. And somewhere in those old hallways, whether in memory or in spirit, there may still be a nurse in a white dress with a red cross on her hat, doing what she has always done, walking the wards, answering buzzers that no one else hears, and tending to patients who cannot help themselves. For as long as I can remember, I've been afraid of the dark. It's not just the kind of fear children have, the fear of what might be hiding under the bed or behind the closet door. Mine was different. Growing up, I never felt alone, even when I was. There was always this quiet, invisible sense that someone else was there with me. Not in a comforting way, but not entirely threatening either, just present. My parents used to tell me that when I was very young, I would talk to someone they couldn't see. They'd find me sitting in a corner, giggling, chatting, or nodding as if listening to an invisible friend. They brushed it off as imagination, but sometimes I think they weren't completely sure. Now, as an adult, I don't believe everything I hear about ghosts or the supernatural. I try to be logical. I like to think that most things have reasonable explanations. Sound reflections, half-asleep dreams, electrical interference, stress. Yet, there are experiences I've had that even the most practical side of me can't explain. The kind that stay with you, quietly haunting your mind whenever you're alone at night. The first time something truly strange happened, I was around 8 years old. I remember it vividly, even now. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of warm, calm day when everything feels peaceful. I was sitting outside in the backyard with my dog, enjoying the quiet. My dog was lying next to me, her head resting on my lap. The neighborhood was still, no cars, no kids playing, no wind. Suddenly, I heard my name, clear as if someone was standing right beside me. "Haley." I froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, precise, and familiar in a way I couldn't place. I looked around, expecting to see someone leaning over the fence or calling from the back door, but there was no one. My parents were inside. The dog hadn't moved, and the air felt strange, thick and heavy. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it must have been an echo, or maybe a neighbor I didn't notice, but deep down, I knew it hadn't come from outside. It had come from right next to me. That moment stayed with me for years. When I was 11, it happened again, but this time it was worse. I was in school, sitting in class during free time. The room was noisy, filled with laughter and chatter. Kids were drawing, reading, or talking in small groups. I was at my desk, doodling quietly, when something odd happened. It was as if someone had placed their hands over my ears. The sounds around me faded, muffled like I was underwater. In that strange silence, a voice came through. It was the same clear voice from years before. It said my name again, softly but urgently, "Haley, Haley." It wasn't the teacher, and it wasn't anyone near me. I looked up, my heart pounding, but everyone else was still laughing and talking as if nothing had happened. Then, as quickly as it started, everything returned to normal. The noise of the classroom came rushing back, and I sat there frozen, pretending nothing had happened. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? It sounded crazy, even to me. Years passed, and the memory of those voices began to fade into the background. We moved to a new house when I was 15, and I thought maybe the strange feeling of being watched would fade too. For a while it did. Life was ordinary again. School, chores, friends, homework. Then one afternoon, something small but unsettling happened. I was plugging in a new appliance in my room. I had just unplugged another item from the socket without switching off the power, which I knew was careless. As I reached to plug in the new one, the power switch on the wall flipped itself off. I froze, staring at it. The movement had been deliberate, not a flicker or mechanical failure. It clicked firmly into the off position right before my fingers touched the plug, as if someone or something had done it to stop me from getting hurt. It didn't scare me immediately. Instead, it left me puzzled, standing there staring at the wall. Then a cold wave ran through me. Maybe it wasn't my imagination. Maybe someone really was there, looking out for me in their own quiet, invisible way. That wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that house. We had a long hallway that led from the living room to the bedrooms. It always felt colder than the rest of the house, no matter the season. My dog, the same one from when I was little, used to stand at the end of that hallway, barking furiously into the emptiness. She'd growl, snap at the air, her hackles raised, her tail stiff. I would check, thinking maybe a shadow or sound had startled her, but there was never anything there. The air always felt still, almost charged, like just before a thunderstorm. Sometimes she would refuse to go down that hallway at all. My mother and sister had their own unsettling moments. On more than one occasion, they both claimed to have been woken up in the middle of the night by something grabbing their arms. Not a gentle touch, a grip. My sister said she felt fingers wrap around her wrist and yank just enough to wake her. My mother's story was even stranger. One night, she accidentally fell asleep in bed with a lit cigarette in her hand. Someone, grabbed her arm sharply enough that the cigarette fell out of her fingers, burning the blanket but not catching it on fire. She woke up gasping, certain she had been pulled awake for a reason. When she told me about it the next day, she laughed nervously, saying maybe it was Granddad watching over me. But her voice shook when she said it. Years later, I moved away. 21 hours away from my mother, in fact. I started my own life, built my own routines, and for a while everything was perfectly normal. No voices, no strange noises, no flickering lights or footsteps. The silence was comforting, like I had finally escaped whatever had followed me through my childhood. Then one day, my mother called. She had been to see a clairvoyant out of curiosity. She hadn't told the woman anything about her life, but as soon as she walked in, the clairvoyant said, "You have a presence attached to you. It's looking for someone whose name starts with an H." My mother told me this casually at first, not realizing what she had said, but when she added, "I forgot to mention, my daughter's name is Haley," we both went quiet. I laughed it off, pretending not to care. but deep down my stomach twisted. What if the presence had followed her there, searching for me? Later that same year, my mother came to visit me. It was nice, normal, warm, full of laughter and catch-ups. When she left a week later, I thought life would go back to its calm rhythm. But something felt different in the house. It's hard to describe, but the air felt heavier again, the quiet no longer peaceful but watchful. A few nights after she left, I was in the kitchen, washing dishes. The sound of running water filled the air. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud bang on the counter next to me. It startled me, but when I turned, there was nothing. I told myself something must have fallen, or maybe I'd imagined it. I went back to washing. Then, seconds later, another bang came, louder this time. I spun around, and that's when I saw one of the cups on the bench rocking back and forth. It wasn't tipping over, just moving in that rhythmic way objects do when they've been placed down firmly. I stood there watching it rock for a full 10 seconds before it stilled. There was a bump in the counter right where the cup sat, and I knew from experience that it only rocked like that when someone put it down hard. Not when it was just sitting there. I whispered out loud, half joking, half serious, "Is that you?" The silence that followed was thick and deep. In that moment, it hit me. Maybe whatever had been with me as a child, the one who whispered my name and flipped the switch to protect me, had found me again. Maybe it had traveled with my mother and returned. That wasn't the end. In fact, things became more noticeable after that. Within the last few days, new events have happened that made me question everything all over again. One night, while sitting in the lounge room, I heard a single guitar string pluck. The guitar was resting on the couch next to me, untouched. It wasn't a random vibration or a bump. It was a clear, deliberate note. One string, the G string, plucked firmly, then muted almost instantly as if a hand had touched it. I just stared at it, too stunned to move. Then, not long after, as I sat in the same spot, I saw something faintly glowing in my peripheral vision. A small white orb of light floated slowly past my doorway, gliding like mist. I turned my head, and it was gone. The air had that same static feel again, like electricity before a storm. The final thing that pushed me past disbelief happened just 2 nights ago. I was sitting on the floor in my bedroom, reading quietly. I heard footsteps on the carpet, slow, steady, soft, but clear. They came from the hallway, moving closer one after another until they reached the doorway. I looked up, smiling automatically, ready to say hello to my boyfriend, assuming it was him coming home. But no one was there. The hallway was empty, silent, and the air felt cold against my skin. The sound stopped right at the door, as though whoever, or whatever it was, had simply stopped and stood there, watching. After that, I turned on every light in the house and sat awake for hours. Even now, I don't know what to think. I tell myself it could all be coincidences, tricks of light, nerves, imagination. Yet some part of me, the same part that once heard my name whispered from nowhere, can't shake the feeling that something or someone has been with me my entire life. Not to hurt me, but to remind me that I am never truly alone. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. When we first moved into the older style house, I didn't think much of it. It had that typical old house feeling. Slightly uneven floors, creaking doors, walls that seemed to hold on to every sound. It didn't feel evil or heavy at first, just old and full of history. But not long after we settled in, small, subtle things started happening, the kind of things you notice, then shrug off until you can't shrug them off anymore. One of the very first strange things began in the bathroom. Now, the bathroom itself was nothing special. Just an ordinary room with an old mirror, tiled floor, and a slightly dated light fitting. But sometimes when I was passing by or standing near it, I would hear the voice of a young girl. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just small, casual comments, like a child speaking from somewhere close by. It didn't sound like it was coming from outside the window or down the hall. It sounded like it was right there, in the bathroom with me. At first, I tried to be logical. I thought maybe it was a toy in the next room, some gadget left switched on, or the TV carrying voices oddly through the walls. I listened carefully, checking the rooms nearby, trying to match the voice to something. But the more I listened, the clearer it became that it was none of those things. The last thing I remember that voice saying was, "Welcome," in a very friendly, almost cheerful tone. It was so close, it's like she was standing right beside me, smiling. That was the moment I ruled out toys or outside noise. There was a personality in that voice, an intent. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I never heard the girl's voice again. It was as if she had introduced herself and then stepped back into the walls. Not long after that, we discovered something even more unsettling. In the hallway, just outside the bathroom, we noticed what looked like the face of a young woman in the wall. It wasn't painted there, and it wasn't a trick of the plaster in dim light. You could only see it when the bathroom light behind the wall was turned on. The light cover cast its own shadow on the wall, shifting slightly when the light or angle changed, but the face didn't move. It was completely independent of the shadow from the light. No matter how the other shadows shifted or lengthened, the face stayed there, fixed, as if it was part of the wall itself. She looked sad. That's what struck me most. Not angry, not terrifying, just deeply, quietly sad. The eyes, the outline of the nose, the suggestion of a mouth, all formed in the texture of the wall in a way that went beyond random patterns. We stared at it again and again, trying to see it as an illusion, but every time we looked, the impression of a young woman's face was there, watching quietly from the plaster. To this day, that face is still there. When the light is on behind the wall, you can see her. When it's off, she disappears into the texture, like she's gone to sleep. Right where that face appears, there's also a slight bulge in the wall, just enough to be noticeable if you run your hand over it. It feels wrong somehow, as if something is underneath. One morning, I woke up and could hear our son playing in the lounge room. I heard the TV on, the familiar sound of children's shows or whatever he was watching at the time. But layered on top of that, there was another voice, a deep voice, speaking in what sounded like an old style of English. It wasn't modern speech. It sounded almost ancient, harsh, and formal. The kind of voice you might expect from some old play or historical reenactment, except it was there in our house, mingling with the sound of cartoons. The tone felt dark, almost evil. I stood there for a while, listening, trying to pick out words, but it faded before I could make sense of it. There was no one else in the house, just my son and the television. We weren't the only ones who noticed things. My mom came to stay for a weekend, just a normal visit, nothing special. One day, she told us she had clearly heard someone say hello to her. It was loud enough and clear enough that she actually went to the door to check if someone was there. She thought maybe a neighbor had called out or someone had come by unexpectedly, but when she opened the door, no one was there. On another night, she told us that while she was in the bedroom, her hairbrush was thrown out of her bag and onto the floor. She hadn't touched her bag. It was sitting in the wardrobe, and she watched the brush come up and out as if something unseen had grabbed it and tossed it. One afternoon, I lay down to take a nap. I was tired and just wanted a bit of rest. I lay on my side with my back facing the edge of the bed, close to the side as I usually do. At some point between waking and sleeping, I became aware of someone standing behind me. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't feel the bed move. I just knew, as clearly as if I could see, that there was someone there. Then a voice started speaking close to my ear, uttering random words that didn't make sense together, a jumble of strange sounds and syllables. The last word I recall hearing sounded like valos, or something very close to that. At the exact same time, I felt something stabbing into my head, not physically, but spiritually, like sharp jabs pushing straight into my skull from the inside. It wasn't like a normal headache or pressure. It felt like something non-physical was poking at me, trying to get in or get my attention. Because of past experiences, I know what it feels like when a spirit touches you. It doesn't feel like a finger or a hand the way a living person might touch you. It feels like something passes through you, as though you were made of smoke, and they pushed a hand into that smoke. You feel a deep, cold sensation that goes inward instead of outward. That was exactly what I felt that day. like invisible spikes of energy stabbing through my head from behind. Then there was the bedroom door. The door was old, and the hinges weren't in the best shape. Eventually, it came off its hinges completely. Before we got around to fixing it, we just leaned it up in the doorway at an angle. It stood there halfway across the opening, balanced but obviously not attached. I'm a cautious person, so every time I went into the room, I made sure not to bump it. I didn't rush past it or slam into it. I would gently slip by, taking care not to knock it over. One day I walked into the room as usual. I moved carefully past the door and headed toward the window on the other side of the room. As I was walking, with my back to the door, it suddenly flew down and crashed toward me. It didn't fall sideways or slide gently. It fell in such a way that it almost came down over the top of me. If I had bumped it hard enough to send it past its balance point, I would have felt the impact. I would have noticed the movement, and by the laws of simple physics, it would have fallen along with me or away from me, depending on the direction of my bump. Instead, it fell forward after I had already passed it, like something had pushed it. It crashed behind me and almost hit me from above. The way it fell didn't match the way I moved. It felt like something else had taken advantage of the precarious position and decided to give it a shove. There were other smaller things that happened more often. We frequently heard slight noises in the kitchen. Soft bangs, the clink of something shifting, the sound of movement when no one was in there. Sometimes we recorded strange sounds and heavy breathing when we left a recorder on at night. One night, I was in the kitchen alone and felt something brush against my legs. It was soft and fluffy, like a dog or cat running past me, pressing lightly against my shins as it squeezed by. But we didn't have a pet there at the time that could have done that, and when I turned around to look, there was nothing. Another night, my partner walked into the kitchen. Just as she passed the bench, a toy that had been sitting on the bench flew off and slammed into the floor. It didn't fall slowly, it didn't bounce or roll. It hit the floor in a single hard motion, like someone had grabbed it and smashed it down. The sound was loud, sharp, and unnatural for such a small object. We both stood there, looking at the toy, feeling the invisible tension in the air. In the lounge room, near the fireplace, I had another strange experience. I was standing there talking to someone, mid-conversation, when I suddenly felt something rushing at me from behind. It was like the air itself was pushing forward in a wave. I instinctively stepped back, assuming it was our son running through the room, maybe playing a game or not watching where he was going. But when I stepped aside and turned, I didn't see him. Instead, I saw a gray, hazy mass, about the size of a person, fly past me very quickly. It moved straight through the room and disappeared. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't nothing either. It was like a thick shadow made of smoke. At another time, I saw a faint outline of a person walking from the kitchen door and straight through the bathroom wall. It wasn't a full-bodied figure with clear features. It was more like a pale, thin shape with human form, moving smoothly without sound. It didn't turn. It didn't look at me. It just walked through space as if the solid wall weren't there. I watched it go and disappear into the wall as if that was the most normal path it could take. Over time, I started noticing random objects in the house moving as if they'd been bumped or kicked. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was a small shift, a tiny sway, something that could be explained away as coincidence. But other times it was clear. A toy rocking back and forth, an item sliding slightly across a surface with no one near it. Then the experiences started getting more physical. One night in bed, I felt something grab my foot and pull. It wasn't a light tug. It was a strong grip, fingers closing around my ankle, yanking it. I jolted awake instantly, heart pounding. The sensation of being grabbed didn't vanish right away. I could still feel the impression of fingers around my foot, a lingering pressure that stayed for a while even though nothing was there. This didn't happen just once. It happened several times on different nights. Each time I woke up with that same disturbing feeling of being held by something unseen. Around this time, my girlfriend began waking up with scratches on her body. On about 3 separate mornings, she woke up with 3-pronged scratches on her forehead. On other occasions, she had random scratch marks on her back and neck. They weren't like marks from accidentally brushing against something rough in her sleep. They were clean, noticeable scratches running across the skin in odd patterns. She didn't remember doing it to herself, and her nails didn't match the marks. This was also when what people would call sleep paralysis began, although I personally don't think that's what it is in my case. Before I explain those episodes, I should mention a period in my past when I lived in a very spiritual town. The town was built near an ancient Aboriginal healing and burial ground, and the whole area had a strange, powerful energy to it. The land felt alive in a way I can't fully describe. While I lived there, I experienced a lot of out-of-body events. Astral travel, waking up unable to move, encounters that went beyond ordinary dreams. From my own experience, I make a distinction between sleep paralysis, out-of-body experiences, and ghostly attacks. When I had what I call a true out-of-body experience, my consciousness remained in my body, but my spirit was elsewhere. In those moments, my body was completely paralyzed. I couldn't move at all, not even a little finger. There was no pressure on my chest, no sense of being sat on or pinned down, no hallucinations standing over me. It was simply my awareness, trapped in a body that wouldn't respond, waiting for my spirit to return. On one especially strange occasion, I awoke in that paralyzed state. Time seemed to stretch out as I lay there, unable to move. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a breeze shoot up into my nostril. It was like a sudden gust of air flowing into my face from the inside. Immediately after that, I could move again. I sat up, completely stunned by what I had felt. On other occasions, my consciousness seemed to leave with my spirit. I would experience astral traveling, floating, flying, moving through strange spaces. When I returned, it was often dramatic. I would rush back toward my body, sometimes feeling as though I flew up through my second-story bedroom window and shot straight at my own chest. Then I'd wake up with a sudden jolt, like I'd landed from a long jump. While living in that town, I also had ghostly encounters that involved being touched, attacked, and even partially possessed. I became very familiar with the difference between a dream, an out-of-body experience, and something else, some kind of external entity interacting directly with me. That's why, when people talk about sleep paralysis purely as a brain glitch, I don't fully agree. I know what paralysis from astral separation feels like. I know what a spirit touch feels like, and I know what it's like to be fully awake and still attacked. Back to the present house. I am a night owl by nature. I often lie in bed long after my partner has fallen asleep, just staring at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds, thinking about random things. On some nights, the noises from around the house, creaks, knocks, faint sounds, make me paranoid. I listen carefully, trying to work out what's normal and what's not. One particular night, I was lying there on my back, still awake, listening. I wasn't drifting off yet. Then, all at once, it felt like something rushed into the bedroom. The air changed. It came with enough force that the curtains moved, as if a strong wind had blown in, even though the windows were closed. A second later, I was pinned to the bed by my chest. It felt like a heavy weight was pressing down directly on my upper body, holding me in place. I tried to call out to my partner, but my voice wouldn't cooperate. I could barely whisper, my throat tight, my mouth heavy. I tried to move my hand to pinch her or tap her shoulder, but my arm felt like it was pushing through thick mud. It would move a little, but not enough. The whole episode lasted maybe 10 to 15 seconds, but it felt much longer. Then, suddenly, the pressure lifted. I could move again, breathe normally, and speak. Several nights passed with no repeat. I started to think maybe it had been a strange one-off, maybe some kind of panic response or something. Then it happened again. Always the same pattern. Lying there, fully aware, then the rush of energy, the sense that something had entered the room, the pressure on my chest, the struggle to move or speak, and then release. It usually happened when I was on my back. But one night, I was lying on my side, very much awake, not even close to asleep, when it hit me again. This time, as I fought against it, I realized I had a bit more movement in my legs than in the rest of my body. I forced myself to kick and managed to bash my partner's foot just enough to wake her. The instant she woke up, the pressure vanished. Each time it happened, I felt pure terror. It wasn't like an OBE, and it wasn't like the quiet paralysis of my spirit being away. This felt aggressive, focused, and external. On one of the more recent attacks, just before it happened, I saw a red orb floating above me. It wasn't huge, but it glowed faintly, a small sphere of red light hovering over my body. I had just enough time to register it before the rush came, and I was pinned down again. Another night, it happened while I was asleep. I started dreaming about the attack. It was so intense that in my dream, I was trying to wake my partner up, calling her name, reaching for her. The feeling of the pressure and the terror in the dream was exactly the same as in real life. The intensity of it jolted me awake. As I opened my eyes, the pressure dropped away and I saw the red orb again, this time moving away, leaving the room. I stayed awake after that, heart racing, staring into the darkness. I know I wasn't dreaming at that point. The orb was real enough to burn itself into my memory. Because these episodes have happened while I am fully awake, while I am aware of my surroundings and not drifting off, I don't believe they are what scientists would call sleep paralysis. I've experienced out-of-body states and know the stillness of those moments. This is something else, something that rushes in with intent, holds me down, and then leaves. I don't know what it is or why it has chosen me. Sometimes I wonder if it's trying to drain my energy, feed on my fear, or even pull my spirit away from my body. I don't have the answer. I just know that it's real. All of this ties back into the things I experienced living in that spiritual town years ago. We had friends there who lived in an old, weathered house with a veranda wrapping around 3 sides. It was the sort of house that looked like it had soaked up generations of stories. After a while, they started opening up to us about strange things happening there. They would hear footsteps on the veranda at night, clear, steady steps walking past their doors. But whenever they checked, no one was there. One night, they had a doll that could laugh or cry depending on how it was set. Out of nowhere, in the middle of the night, the doll started both laughing and crying at the same time, over and over. It wouldn't stop. They took the batteries out, thinking it was malfunctioning, but it kept going. In the end, they had to smash it apart to make it stop. One night, my mom was babysitting at that house. I decided to go over and see her. When I arrived, I thought it would be funny to play a prank on her, especially given all the strange stories they'd told us. I made some noises on the veranda and then quickly hid around the corner behind an old dryer or some large appliance. I waited, trying not to laugh. She opened the door, looked around, didn't see anything, and went back inside. I did it again, making another noise and hiding in the same place. This time she didn't open the door. As I crouched there waiting, I suddenly felt a strong sense of presence behind me. Not just the feeling of someone standing nearby, but something more intense, thick in the air. I stood up slowly and turned to look. In the far corner of the veranda, I saw 3 figures. 3 ghosts staring back at me with cold, unblinking eyes. On the left was a man who looked relatively modern, dressed in pants and a shirt, the kind of clothing you might see on someone from a few decades ago. On the right was an old Aboriginal man, wearing a loincloth and holding a spear. He had a strong, ancient look about him, like he belonged to the land more than to the house. In between them was a smaller figure, harder to make out, almost like a child or something hunched. I couldn't see its face clearly. All 3 of them stared at me with an expression that wasn't exactly angry, but definitely not friendly. It was a cold, measuring look, as if they were deciding what to do with me. I stood there and looked right back at them for what felt like 5 long seconds. My heart hammered, but I forced myself not to panic. I didn't want to trip or stumble like someone in a bad horror movie, so I turned carefully and walked toward the door as calmly as I could manage. As I moved, I felt a hand go through my head from behind, as if something had reached out and tried to grab me. It wasn't the feeling of a solid hand, it was that same spirit sensation, sliding through my skull instead of around it. I never looked back. I knocked on the door, and as I did, in my mind I kept pleading silently to the ghosts that I was a welcome friend to the house, that I meant no harm. Once I got inside, I told my mom what had happened, my words stumbling over each other. At one point, trying to sound brave, I said something like, "I'm not scared of ghosts." Almost immediately after saying that, I felt something tickling my foot under the table. It was not a random twitch or itch. It was a clear, playful stroke across my skin. The kind of touch that says, "Oh, really? You're not scared?" My mom later told me that while sleeping in one of the kids' beds in that same house, she had felt the weight of someone sitting at the end of the bed. She saw the indentation on the mattress, like someone invisible had taken a seat. Back at our own house in that town, things were also active. The TV channels would sometimes switch on their own, the VCR would start doing strange things without any input, as if someone unseen was pressing buttons. We had heard that the elderly owner of the house had died there, and it was easy to believe he hadn't entirely left. One day, I was in the kitchen. I had 3 cups of tea prepared and was waiting for the kettle to boil. I was just standing there with a teaspoon in my hand, not thinking about anything much. Suddenly, I got goosebumps all over my body. Every hair on my arms and neck stood on end. I felt a strong presence come into the room and then into me. It was like something walked right into my body, taking up space inside my skin. I couldn't move, not out of fear, but because I simply had no control for a moment. My arm then flew out on its own and started tapping a melody on the 3 teacups with the spoon. It wasn't random banging. It was a clear, pretty little old-fashioned tune. When it finished, the presence left as quickly as it had come, and I could move again. I stood there, heart racing, holding the spoon, thinking, well, that definitely wasn't me. Around that time, I was having a lot of out-of-body experiences too, which made everything feel even more intensely connected. We brought someone's cat into the house once, and the poor thing completely freaked out. It managed to squeeze through a tiny hole into the back of an old television, trying to get away from something none of us could see. Later one night, that same cat was on my bed, looking deeply uncomfortable. Suddenly, under the blanket near my legs, something that felt like an arm shot up toward the cat. The cat jumped and bolted. I felt the motion under my blankets and knew it wasn't my own limb. We were moving soon anyway and had started storing some of our belongings in the house next door. That house belonged to a very old lady whose husband had died there not long before. I took the cat over there, hoping it would feel calmer, but as soon as I put it down, it freaked out again. It ran into a room and hid under the bed. I followed it, stepping into the room, and the moment my foot crossed the threshold, a calendar hanging on a hook on the wall started spinning around in circles, fast, like something out of a cartoon. At the same time, the long drapes in the room were blowing wildly in spirals, as if some powerful wind was whipping through the place. The cat sat under the foot of the bed, staring up and around as if it could see something moving all over the room. It looked absolutely terrified. The calendar kept spinning and spinning, and the curtains kept whipping and twisting around. Even though there was no open window, no draft, I stepped back out of the room into the hallway, and suddenly the house was calm again. Still, quiet, not a hint of movement anywhere, as if nothing had just happened. That town was full of places like that, places where the veil between worlds felt thinner. Several houses I visited there had their own hauntings. A friend from that area who still lives there told me recently that she often feels watched while she's in the shower, but in a strange, almost friendly way. She also told me she attended a funeral in that town and could sense ghosts all over the place, as if the living were outnumbered by the dead. All of these experiences, old and new, gentle and violent, helpful and terrifying, have shaped the way I see the unseen world. I don't have all the answers. I don't know exactly what is attacking me at night in my current house, or what the red orb is, or who the sad-faced girl in the wall might be. I don't know why something keeps tugging at my foot and scratching my girlfriend's skin in sets of 3. I only know that these things are happening, and that they fit into a lifetime of strange encounters that I can't simply dismiss as tricks of the mind. I'm left with questions, a sense of being watched, and the deep feeling that, in my life, I have never truly been alone. I grew up in a crowded apartment block on the outskirts of one of the largest cities in my little European country. Most of what I knew of forests, or nature at all, came from school trips, rough playgrounds, or the occasional family holiday in a rented cottage. Even so, I had always felt drawn to places where the streetlights stopped and real darkness began. My two closest friends felt the same. Martin lived 2 tram stops from me and spent his afternoons drawing sketches of dragons or watching survival shows on a scratched-up laptop. Wolf, whose real name is Marius, but who earned the nickname in primary school because of the way he howled songs he liked, was the strongest, the broadest, and the most fearless among us. All 3 of us shared the same itch for a night sky that actually showed more than a handful of dim stars. And, at that time, none of us had driving licenses. So once the summer of 2019 began to slide toward September, we started talking about finding a cabin we could reach by train, carrying our supplies on our backs like weekend soldiers, and disappearing for a few nights to do exactly what big city parents warn their children not to do: drink too much, talk too loudly, and laugh like fools in the middle of a silent forest. By then I was 18, 6 years into lifting weights and counting protein scoops. A recent doctor's visit measured me at a hair under 185 centimeters and just over 90 kilos. Wolf was heavier by at least 10 and sporting the kind of shoulder span that made older men step aside on narrow pavements. Martin stood thinner, pale from long hours indoors, but he could walk half a marathon without complaint. It seemed only right the 3 of us would mark the final warm weekend before school and work schedules locked us in concrete again by disappearing to a place without street names. Martin's uncle owned a log cabin. It sat on a square plot of scrub and pines about 35 miles from the nearest city, big enough to rate its own motorway exit. The cabin belonged to an older cousin most of the year, but the cousin was backpacking through Asia at the time, and the uncle kept the keys. He hardly cared who used the place as long as nothing burned down. Martin texted him, got a thumbs up, and 2 days later we were shouldering battered hiking packs and shoving our way through the after-work crowd at the central train station. Inside our packs we'd stuffed 3 bottles of bargain vodka, 1 case of cheap canned lager, a sack of charcoal for the outdoor grill, half a kilo of bacon, a half-dozen cling-wrapped steaks from a discounter freezer, 3 loaves of bread, packets of noodles, tins of beans, instant coffee, bandages, disinfectant, and 2 enormous bags of marshmallows. Wolf added his father's knife, the long one stamped Solingen on the blade, just in case a wild boar decides it wants our breakfast. Martin packed a handheld Bluetooth speaker. I brought a little first aid kit and a set of fresh batteries for the cabin's battered torch, because only Martin had actually seen the cabin, and he swore none of the bulbs inside worked anymore. The train left at 19:01 on the dot, rattling north through suburbs that quickly flattened into fields where sunflower heads hung like tired guards. The carriage felt colder than I expected. Air conditioning turned too high, and for the first half hour, we shivered in t-shirts and tried to look like we understood train schedules, even though we barely rode outside city limits. At 20:10, the conductor clipped our tickets, nodded at our packs, and warned us to check the return timetable. "The first train back on Monday is 0540, he said. "Miss that, and you wait until noon." We vowed not to miss anything. The fact that a 12-hour wait would strand us in the middle of nowhere without mobile data still sounded romantic. Dusk fell as we stepped onto an empty platform in a village too small to show on most maps. It consisted of a boarded cafeteria, 1 yellow phone booth half filled with spiderwebs, and a cracked information sign advertising archery lessons to build team spirit. Martin unfolded the paper map his uncle had marked in red pen. The path from station to cabin looked simple. Walk east on the only asphalt road until it dwindled to dirt, keep going for half a kilometer, cross a stream beside a retired watermill, and climb the ridge. From there, a signpost supposedly pointed toward 3 holiday cottages. Martin's uncle had circled the leftmost one. Simple, except forest tracks never respect printed directions. Our walk took almost an hour longer than we expected. Stars soaked through the purple sky. By the time we spotted the black shape of the cabin roof among silhouettes of pine, each of us had nearly emptied a water bottle. Sweat darkened shoulder straps, and the straps on my pack carved trenches in the skin. We pushed open a gate of flaking larch planks and clicked headlamps on. The cabin was bigger than I had imagined from Martin's descriptions. 2 stories, a wide porch with steps sagging from snow years, windows latched with iron crosses. Inside, the ground floor kitchen smelled of stale smoke and last winter's wood ash. A small bedroom opened to the right, a single bed stacked with folded wool blankets and a dusty book of folk ballads on the nightstand. A steep staircase climbed to a miniature landing that had just enough room to turn toward another door. Martin said the upstairs bedroom held 2 beds. Wolf called dibs, laughing that the 2 wolves sleep above, the lone fox sleeps below, ruffling Martin's hair. Martin might have punched him if he were not so tired. We kicked off boots, flicked the torch beam along wooden rafters, found no spider the size of Wolf's hand, and decided that counted as good luck. Our phones showed no bars, which pleased us more than the cheap vodka. Unpacking became a parade. Bottles on the kitchen table, food on shelves, bedding unfurled. Martin discovered an old cast-iron pan still hanging by the chimney and scrubbed it as best he could with cold water and handfuls of moss. Outside, Wolf had already begun dragging fallen limbs into a pile a safe distance from the porch. He stacked them in a tent shape, stones around the base, charcoal in the heart, and lit the pyramid with one of Martin's precious kitchen matches. The flames licked tall enough to brush first night stars. Where orange light met indigo sky, the edges turned bruised purple. Mosquitoes whined, but kept mostly to the dark. The evening began the way every campfire evening should. Shirt sleeves rolled up, boots off, meat hissing in bacon grease, and all of us leaning back on rusted folding chairs staring at sparks ascending like manic fireflies. We toasted our own bravery, city boys who walked 3 kilometers, and laughed at ourselves for feeling brave over something any countryside grandparents would call a morning stroll. Martin played 1980s Czech rock on the Bluetooth speaker. Wolf cracked marshmallow rods over his knee. We argued over which Hollywood action hero could kill an alien with a spoon the quickest. Midnight drew near. The embers sank. We were drunk enough that climbing the stairs looked dangerous, so we stayed outside close to the heat. Sometime around 1 a.m., none of us checked a watch. The conversation evaporated. It was not that we finished a topic. Words simply fell away into a hush so absolute I wondered if my ears had clogged. The last cicada rasp faded mid-buzz, like a tape recorder switched off. Even the fire quieted, logs collapsing in slow motion as though respectful. I remember tilting my head toward the trees, expecting wind. No wind. The air felt swollen, pressing the smell of smoke and hot resin against our faces. Wolf set down his bottle. "Too quiet," he muttered, and I knew he meant far beyond night forest quiet. Leaves far off the path rustled. A moving body heavy enough to disturb ground shrubs was circling perhaps 40 meters away. The darkness beyond the fire blinded us. We could not see further than the flame radius. My fingers closed around the handle of Wolf's father's knife, still stuck in a chopping block after trimming kindling. The rustling paused, resumed on the opposite side. The pattern was deliberate. Approach, stop, move back, reapproach. A half circle drawn over and over. I whispered, "Boar?" But none of us believed it. Wild boars grunt, snuffle, make no attempt at stealth. Whatever paced cared nothing for our firelight. I stood to collect another log, half to give my hands purpose. That was when the first light appeared. At the end of the track leading away from the cabin, about 30 feet beyond the flames, something pale floated between trunks. It looked like a child's glow stick, sickly green with a yellow heart, held steady at chest height. It glided left, paused, drifted right. Wind did not swing it. The moment I fixed on it, the rustling ceased. I pointed. Martin squinted, then laughed. Probably a late tourist with a phone. He cupped his hands and shouted, "Nentadiko vidit, camarada." No sights to see here, friend, but the light did not jerk or flash in reply the way a hiker might wave. It simply stilled, like an insect under a pin. In drunken courage, I hollered the stupid joke, "If there's someone there, put your dick high up in the air." Wolf wheezed. Martin rolled eyes. The forest answered with utter silence so thick my scalp tingled. No airplane drone, no distant dog. The glow steadied brighter for one beat, then bloomed 3 meters sideways as though whatever held it took a sudden leap. It blinked out. The night swallowed it. Instantly, the rustle began again, heavier, closing. Wolf set his beer down with a clink. reached for a thick branch, and said in a low voice, "Back in." None of us argued. We left the fire unbanked, shoulders hunched in case something charged, and hustled to the porch. I slammed shut the door, slid the iron latch, and felt foolish. That latch would not stop a normal bear, let alone anything exotic. We cracked the curtains a finger's width. Firelight flickered bright outside, writhing shadows across tree trunks, but after 10 heartbeats nothing moved. Martin shrugged, mumbled we scared ourselves with theories, and headed to the downstairs room. He lay on the single mattress, boots still on, and within 2 minutes his breathing deepened. Wolf and I crept upstairs, tension replaced by drowsiness and vodka fog. Our room's window faced the opposite side of the clearing. Nothing but thin birch trunks blocked the moon. We left curtains half open, reasoning more light meant more warning. I crawled under wool blankets, still smelling faintly of naphthalene. Listened to Wolf's bottle cap belt buckle clink as he dumped spare change from his pockets. My head swam. The last thing I thought before sleep punched me was that jokes about airborne dicks sounded less funny at 1:30 a.m. than at midnight. A crash yanked me from dream, glass shattering, a roar, Martin screaming. I sat up into black. Wolf swore and flung off covers. The knife he had stowed under his pillow glinted in moonlit gloom. Another scream tore through the cabin, high-pitched, strangled, so loud the timbers seemed to vibrate. Martin. Wooden boards thumped downstairs, something heavy moving all at once. Wolf pushed past me, slamming shoulder first through our door, and barreled toward the stair. I scrambled behind. Halfway down the staircase, Wolf stopped so suddenly I almost plowed into him. The scene below froze me mid-step. Martin lay on his back on the kitchen floor, heel of one boot braced against the table leg, both arms flailing as he kicked. Clamped around his shin was a hand, or what looked like a hand, only larger, webbed between long fingers that ended in claws. The limb glimmered gray-green in our phone's flashlight beams. It sprouted from a crouched figure, no higher than Wolf's shoulder, yet impossibly elongated in limb. The creature's head swiveled toward us. 2 eyes, black like midnight pits, swallowed the torchlight. Its jaw opened. Inside, needle teeth glistened, crowded like shark rows. The stench of algae, rot, stagnant pond water rolled across the cramped room, turning my stomach. Wolf shouted, leapt the final 2 steps, and swung his knife down on the thing's wrist. Metal met cartilage with a wet snap. The creature shrieked, an ululating note that reminded me of broken violins, and released Martin's leg. It scrambled backward, unnaturally fast, crab walking on hands oddly bent and legs jointed wrong. When it hit the doorway, instead of turning it sprang, clearing threshold and porch in one motion, disappearing into solid dark beyond the bonfire glow. The second it vanished, every candle flame and coal ember puffed outward as if vacuumed. Sparks whirled up the chimney flue, though no wind blew. I felt the cabin walls exhale. Martin groaned. His trouser leg was shredded, calf striped with bloody gouges. Wolf knelt, using torn dishcloths to stanch bleeding. I, still fixed on the open doorway, felt the tremor in my thighs. Adrenaline dissolved vodka fog. "Close that," Wolf barked, tipping his chin at the door. I lurched forward, grabbed the knob. Before I swung it, movement flicked beyond the last ring of firelight. The creature crouched 10 meters away, arms dangling, torso heaving. In the same breath, its head jerked sideways, and from the opposite tree line, another shape answered. Shorter, thin, but unmistakably the same species. It waded into flame glow, webbed feet scraping. Between the two, something passed I could not hear. A chitter, perhaps inaudible to human ears. They parted, each sidling toward a window. I slammed the door, threw the latch, dragged a chair under the knob. Wolf lifted Martin, one shoulder under his arms, and hobbled upstairs. I grabbed the torch, the blood-smeared knife, the half-empty vodka bottle, for disinfection, not courage, though maybe both, and followed. In the upstairs room, Wolf set Martin on his own bed, propped pillow under knee, then told me to hold pressure while he searched the small trunk by the wall. He found the packet of bandages, unrolled gauze with surgeon calm, and poured vodka along the grooves. Martin arched, teeth gritted, but remained silent. The scratches looked deep, but not fatal. No tendon glistened, thank God. Claws thunked against the cabin's side, the slow scratch of talon over wood. Then again, low on the wall, then higher, as though the creature tested seams. Wolf extinguished the torch. We killed our phone screens. Moonlight alone illuminated the room. Boards creaked downstairs. Something walked the hall, sniffing, pausing, sniffing. The stench rose again. Algae, something long dead dredged from swamp bottom. A wet palm brushed the outside of our door, its click faint but clear. Wolf tensed and tipped his knife at the keyhole. The handle turned, but the latch held. The clicking stopped. Minutes dragged. Things circled the house. Through a crack in the shutters, Wolf saw one silhouette past the single upstairs window opposite us. Pale skin shone wax-like. It pressed face to glass. 2 orbs swallowed the moon's shimmer. Wolf inhaled so sharply his nostrils hissed. The creature's head bobbed as though scenting, then slipped from view. Nothing hammered. Nothing spoke. Only the glide of claws against aging wood. We waited. The vodka fumes turned the room rancid. Each heartbeat counted 3. At last, the scratching receded, boards eased, soil rustled outside, and the rank smell thinned. Somewhere deeper in forest brush cracked. Water splashed once, perhaps the pond Martin and I had visited, then stillness returned. Wolf whispered, "Count to 500 before we move." I counted each number, terrified my breath might add a digit. Dawn seeped into plank seams, gray then pink. The forest outside chirped with birds we had not heard by night. We crept downstairs. No blood except Martin's. The shattered window above sink littered glass across counter. Mud-smeared footprints led from sill to kitchen, then back to hall. Each print thin, elongated, toes fused by web. The table showed grooved scratches where Martin must have clawed for purchase. Outside, our camp chairs were overturned. All food bags vanished. Even the leftover steaks had been scooped off the grill. One chair bore claw gouges through canvas. The fire pit lay cold, embers doused, water pooled inside ringstones. We packed in grim silence. Martin limped but refused help. I lashed planks over the broken window with duct tape found in the trunk so at least Martin's uncle wouldn't return to a wide hole. Wolf wrote a note, bare break-in, an apology, promises to buy new chairs, and left it under the spoon rack. Then we shouldered packs that felt twice heavier without rest and hurried toward the road, staying in tight formation. The path that took 4 hours in darkness shrank to 90 minutes under a sun already harsh. At the station, we waited for the first train, checking every few breaths the tree line behind the platform. The rails gleamed empty. A crow picked at a crisp packet. No footsteps approached. The world presented itself as ordinary. On the carriage ride home, we spoke little. Martin's leg oozed through the gauze into his sock. Wolf watched pine forests blur by and fingered the knife as though expecting the blade to speak. I stared at my reflection in the window, pale and shocked, and understood how pointless my gym hours felt beside something whose strength bent wood like wax. We did not tell girlfriends or parents anything, except that vandals stole our supplies, and one of us stepped on broken glass. Even writing this 2 years later, my fingers hesitate. What good can come from describing a creature that mainstream biology denies? Yet that the image stays. Skin like drowned moonlight, eyes blacker than midnight ice, and a mouth so perfectly designed for puncturing flesh that my pulse stalls remembering. Sometimes, walking home past a drainage canal behind my urban flat, I see water glisten under street lamp and smell, just for a flash, the stink of stagnant pond. When that happens, I hurry my steps and imagine webbed fingers slicing the surface beneath. I have not returned to Martin's uncle's cabin, and I pray no other curious soul decides to swim in that silent, reed-walled pond. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I was 14 the summer. Everything changed. 14 and certain that nothing truly bad could happen as long as I stuck to the usual routine that had carried me through every vacation since primary school. Home was a mid-sized city ringed by a scruffy greenbelt. From the top floors of the block where my parents rented a flat, you could see tree crowns rippling over the hills in waves of dark and light, and beyond those hills, if the sky was clean after rain, the first low ridges of real mountains cut a jagged silhouette. Between the edge of housing estates and the first line of summits lay a patchwork of fields, abandoned orchards, and most important to me, a state forest that older maps still labeled with a half-erased German name, left over from the time our region served as a frontier for somebody else's empire. The forest had been ignored by most out-of-town hikers ever since a newer motorway offered quicker access to national parks farther south. That suited local teenagers fine. We called the place simply the woods, as though it were the only woods on Earth. As though those 50 or 60 square kilometers of oak and pine and swampy birch stands were ours by birthright. My cousin Marek, everyone outside the family calls him just Mark, but at home he is always Marek, was 18 months older than I, tall enough that teachers sometimes mistook him for a substitute staff member, and strong in the rangy way of boys who have done farm chores since childhood. His family lived on the city's western fringe where asphalt fizzled into gravel. And the moment my last exam ended, he began texting me plans the way he always did. A day trip first, then an overnight if his mother allowed, then, if summer stretched long enough, a weekend pushing deeper than we had ever gone. He liked to boast that we could walk from our grandmother's front gate straight through the forest to the foothills without crossing a paved road more than twice. That claim might not have been strictly true. Logging tracks wound everywhere like fishing net. But it sounded thrilling to a boy who had spent most of year 9 bent over algebra worksheets. Our parents never objected to daytime rambles because we knew the broad access trails by heart and carried second-hand compasses clipped to our belt loops. An overnight trip required more negotiation. My uncle believed in lessons learned firsthand, but still insisted we pack a torch, backup batteries, a lighter, a coil of soft rope, 2 bottles of water each, and a plastic whistle in case one of us put a foot in a hole and snapped a bone. Marek owned everything on that list except the whistle. I borrowed one from my mother's kitchen drawer. Packing done, we slung bargain store rucksacks onto our shoulders, met at the tram stop just before 7 o'clock, and rode to the terminus where track workers were banging on a broken switch with iron hammers. From there, a disused freight spur, thick with weeds, cut a lazy curve toward the woods, and we followed its cinder bed the way children follow a legend's dotted line. Though the official sunset would not arrive until nearly 9, dusk pooled early under the taller trees. Marek talked about a cliff he had discovered the previous August, when he and 2 classmates chased a stray sheep deeper and deeper until the bleeding creature found its home, leaving the boys alone at the rim of what Marek swore was the best lookout for kilometers. He wanted to photograph the view on my father's old digital camera, the only model still lying around our house that did not rely on rechargeable batteries. If we timed it right, he said, we would reach the cliff before full darkness and could watch the lights of distant villages flicker on one by one like candles in glass jars. The hike went smoothly. Underfoot the soil was dry, baked gold by weeks without real rain. The air smelled of pine resin and dust. At the half-hour mark, Marek stepped off the disused track onto a narrower trail, packed hard by deer hooves. Grass seeds tugged at our socks, but the path curled upward in gentle switchbacks, and we moved fast. By the time the sky turned violet, we had climbed a natural stairway of sandstone blocks and emerged onto Marek's cliff. He had not exaggerated. The shelf jutted far enough that we saw the forest canopy spread below like a rolling sea, each ripple a treetop, each dark hollow a shadowed ravine. Northward the land flattened into fields already swallowed by dusk, and beyond those fields 3 water towers and an office block caught the last slanted rays. Marek balanced on a rock the shape of a worn throne, held the camera at arm's length, and snapped 6 pictures. I sat cross-legged near the brink, elbows on knees, letting breeze cool sweat on my ribs. We stayed until the afterglow drained from the horizon and the earliest stars pricked holes in the indigo. A faint moon, little more than half-grown, climbed through haze on the far side of the valley. When we judged our eyes adjusted, Marek stuffed the camera back in its pouch, hitched his pack, and said we should start home while the forest still offered hints of color instead of pitch. The quickest way back to the tram stop was a straight line that would save 20 minutes compared with retracing our ascent. We knew that trail too. It arrowed downhill following a shallow ravine, crossed a ditch, wound beside a seasonal creek, and emerged into an abandoned orchard, whose upper branches the local cooperative had forgotten to harvest. Counting those landmarks mentally reassured me. If I reached the orchard, I could find the freight spur by smell alone. We must have walked that route more than a dozen times over previous summers. Nevertheless, 15 minutes into the descent, a sensation rippled through me, as sudden and absolute as a slap, that something watched from beyond the fringe of our torch beams. I am not known for nerves. Still, the feeling hit so hard my steps faltered, my mouth dried. I shot a glance behind us, saw nothing but tree trunks receding in columns. Ahead, Marek padded on, flashlight swinging steady arcs across the undergrowth. Twice before on other trips I had spooked myself with thoughts of wolves or poachers and discovered nothing except scurrying fox kits. I told myself this was the same, an echo of motion sensed rather than seen, a shadow where none belonged. I planted boots firmly and shook off the shiver. The feeling clung like spider silk. A branch snapped up slope. Dry, loud. Marek stopped. Torchlight jumped from leaves to bark. "Did you see that?" he whispered. In the dim glow, his face looked oddly boise despite his height. He was not joking. Fright cramped his features. I opened my mouth, as much to calm him as to answer, but before any reassurance came, another crack sounded. Bigger, heavier. Then silence fell so complete my eardrums seemed to ring. Even at night, a forest breathes. Wind moves needles, insects hum, distant cars mutter, owls ask questions. Here, none of that. The hush pressed our throats. We hesitated a dozen seconds. Another twig snapped, this time lower on the slope to our right. Marek swung his beam. The circle of light crawled across fern crowns, across a cedar trunk, then halted. What stood behind that trunk should have been just another patch of darkness. But the outline wrong. A body emerged from the gloom, tall enough that its head brushed first branches, maybe 2.5 meters. Thin but taut, limbs proportioned like a sprinter's, yet longer, the joints hinged too far back. Skin, not fur, glimmered sallow, gray-green, stretched over bone as if wind had blown away every fat cell. The chest rose and fell with silent breaths. Ribs showed. 3 of those ribs looked torn, open, as though fungus had eaten the flesh between. Light caught eyes. 2 saucers glowing not predator green, but a molten orange rimmed in yellow like cinders in a forge. I knew deer skulls. Marek's father mounted 2 above the mantel. The head atop this body resembled such a skull flensed of flesh, yet patches of withered membrane still clung, shining wet. Empty nose slits stared like twin wounds. Where antlers might have sprouted, only scars remained. A mouth yawned wide. Teeth, countless slender spikes, lined the jaws in predatory rows. For what felt longer than any school hour, we and the creature regarded each other. No wind stirred. I tried to swallow but found no saliva. Marek breathed loud enough, I feared he would provoke a lunge. "Come here," the thing said. The words vibrated deeper than my bass practice voice, dragging syllables across gravel. Smokers rasp, but stretched lower still. A bass clarinet played inside a hollow log. "Come here," it repeated, extending one hand from behind the tree. Fingers twice as long as mine ended in claws that reflected torchlight red. I did not decide to flee. My legs ripped themselves free and flew. Marek wheeled mid-stride, grabbed my sleeve, and together we bolted. Adrenaline erased fatigue. Though Marek outweighed me, I matched his stride, and down the slope we ran reckless, tripping, righting ourselves, yanking hair-snagging branches out of the way. Behind us that voice roared, not words this time but an animal sound, higher than any man yet laced with iron, a scream layered of a cat in pain and a woman tossed into a well. The noise stabbed the eardrum, drove us faster. No plan guided us, instinct did. We slammed through brush, stumbled onto the seasonal creek bed, splashed ankle-deep before hauling ourselves up the far bank. The orchard appeared where it always did. Leafy silhouettes, heavy with wormy fruit scented like cider. Moonlight reflecting off fallen apples. 50-odd meters across that clearing lay the old fence that paralleled the freight spur. 30 minutes walk from there to the tram tracks in daylight. At our panic pace, maybe a quarter hour. I risked a glance back. At the tree line, the creature paused. Its eyes blazed and narrowed as if considering whether to follow. When we crossed the orchard midpoint, it stepped from behind the trunks, gait silent on dew-wet grass, limbs bending backwards so the body prowled low without crouching. I shook Marek's shoulder, pointed. Together we veered right, vaulting a toppled fence post, then angled left. desperate to break its line of sight. Marek sucked air. My calves burned hydrogen flame. Still the thing pursued, unhurried, matching speed without visible exertion. Near the railbed wires hung from an old telephone pole. I recognized the wooden stile we had clambered at dusk. Marek first, then I, flung ourselves over. Loose stones slipped under boots. At the far verge stretched a damp meadow, and beyond it, another wall of black trees. There lay the final barrier before street lamps and concrete. We darted across. Halfway I heard heartbeat loud in my skull. Or was it hoofbeat? The creature had hopped the stile. Under moonlight its bent legs straightened in leaps covering meters. The voice came again. A croak, a cough, words I could not decipher but which made Marek stumble. I seized his elbow and yanked him upright. Together we crashed into the next copse of birches. Branches broke around us. Some of those breaks were ours, others not. And then, silence. The kind from earlier but deeper, because it fell after so much racket. We halted, backs against thin trunks, tasting blood in our mouths. No glow eyes, no footsteps, only distant, normal frog chirps. I dared breathe. Marek's torch had ceased functioning during the sprint. The lens was smashed. We considered using phone flashlights but feared any beacon. Instead, we climbed a shallow ditch and found the dirt lane paralleling the old spur. That track led, as Marek remembered, to a waterworks pump house near the railway station. We followed it, stumbling often, but the phosphorescent paint on pump house doors finally peeked through dark. Beyond, sodium lamps cast weak orange halos on concrete. Civilization. We fell to hands and knees on gravel, panting, lungs wheezing. All aches that adrenaline had masked returned triple. From the forest edge, a screech burst. It was the same hybrid wail, cat being murdered inside a woman's throat, but louder. Every hair on my scalp stood. I scrambled onto the station platform as Marek slammed the service gate behind us. No train stood waiting, none due until morning. We kept running, along track ballast, past shuttered warehouses, through silent suburbs, not slowing until streetlights brightened into familiar shopfronts. At Marek's block, we hammered at the intercom. His mother buzzed us upstairs and recoiled at our mud-plastered jeans. She eyed the scratches on Marek's arms, the bruise blooming on my shin. But Marek said only that a wild dog chased us. We were exhausted. Please let us shower and collapse. She believed enough to fetch disinfectant, but not enough to phone animal control. In our room, we locked the window and drew curtains, though morning birds already twittered. There ends the event's raw footage. In 48 hours, Marek's mother pried a cleaner version from us. Something about stray dogs. We exaggerated for drama. We are sorry. Next time we carry pepper spray. She accepted that because she wanted normal fears. I never offered the true version. Marek and I barely speak of it except via raised eyebrows when a documentary mentions forest spirits. Summer moved on. School restarted. Marek joined a local football club. I buried myself in chemistry prep, hoping for a scholarship that might carry me far from the freight spur. We returned to the woods only on daylight group picnics, and even then we avoided the cliff by silent, mutual agreement. Occasionally, the memory needles me awake. Moonlight on hollow eye sockets, that impossible low voice inviting us close. I replay the moment I aimed a torch at bone-revealed ribs, and wonder whether 3 missing ribs meant the creature was starved or already dead in some sense, walking on desire alone. The rational layers of my mind say many people smarter than I believe in no monster not catalogued by zoology. Yet the skin between shoulder blades puckers whenever I pass the city boundary after dusk. I stopped weightlifting for a month. No number of bench presses mattered beside a thing whose muscles worked like hinge springs. Maybe one night the forest will spit out that shape again. Maybe next time its invitation will not sound mockingly polite. For now I take the long route home, avoid overgrown paths near ponds, and sleep lighter than any boy of 16 should. If you ever stand on a moonlit cliff and feel watched, remember that not every watcher is satisfied with watching, and some invitations are older and hungrier than any answer you can give. I spent the bulk of my childhood and adolescence roaming the middle counties of Pennsylvania. That rolling patchwork of farmland and low forested ridges, sandwiched between the more famous Appalachian Spine and the tidal rivers that drain eastward into the Atlantic. Long before I cared about driver's license zones and congressional districts, I understood the place in a gut way. Asphalt that breaks into gravel if you wander far enough. Grocery stores that shut at 8. Churches that still ring bells on weeknights. Coyote calls rising thin and hard over hayfields. Deer edging out of soybean rows at dusk. 2 decades of living there branded a certain cadence in me, so when work tugged my parents south, down near the Mason-Dixon line, it took me a while to realize how different the microclimates, the accent shadings, and what country people call critters could be. Even so, by the time I turned 26, I had mapped that new corner, insofar as anybody who did not grow up inside it can map a place, and felt comfortable enough to drive back roads after midnight without second-guessing every rustle in the roadside thickets. My habit, whenever life planted me somewhere fresh, was to start exploring as soon as the last unpacked box collapsed flat under my mattress. I need to know the loops I can walk at dawn, the cheap diners that open before sunrise, the service roads that feed into lanes nobody bothers to plow in February. Once I feel those paths in my muscles, the territory quits spooking me. That private ritual is how I ended up volunteering, one muggy July week 4 years ago, to do a favor for a grad school friend who was relocating from Harrisburg to Philadelphia. His apartment search conflicted with an internship orientation, and he wanted eyes on a few neighborhoods in Upper Darby on the city's western shoulder before he signed anything. I had a long weekend, a reliable sedan, and nothing better on my schedule than topping the lawn and recalking a bathtub. I said yes. The drive from my adopted town to Philly is not epic. Roughly 2 hours of traffic on the turnpike cooperates, but the landscape flips personalities several times. You start among murmuring cornfields, ease into low industrial land laced with distribution hubs, then slip under rail viaducts where graffiti blooms in layers older than my wardrobe. Finally, the skyline stabs up, glass and steel wearing summer haze like silk. I enjoy watching that transition. The one part I dislike is the no-man's land of off-ramps near the Delaware. Warehouses too new to have lost their sparkle, SUVs idling at every light, something about the whole expanse smelling of scorched rubber and resignation. When I passed those beige rectangles on that particular Friday, nothing unusual registered. Yet, a mile or two later, gliding down an exit ramp bound for Upper Darby, a prickling sensation needled the back of my neck, like a single hair trapped beneath a shirt tag or the crisp slap of a strong static discharge. I scratched, felt nothing, dismissed it as a mosquito bite. The tingling evaporated, and I devoted all attention to the unglamorous business of hunting parking meters. Upper Darby baked under a heat advisory. On the sidewalks, teenagers sprayed each other with drugstore water guns. A man in an orange safety vest pried gum away from a trolley track while his partner leaned on a shovel, wiping sweat off his chin with a forearm that looked as though it spent nights submerged in fryer grease. Every storefront had propped its door open to tempt pedestrians with refrigerated gusts that smelled of onions or nail polish remover or tanning lotion. I love cities and grew up visiting Philadelphia on school trips, so I did what I always do. Rolled down the windows, tuned the radio to a jazz station, waited 9 cycles for a left turn arrow, and studied the ratio of bodegas to liquor stores. Not once in those first half-hour loops did I spot anything that explained why that odd tickle flared again, across the same patch of skin at the nape of my neck. As sensations go, it was mild, but its persistence annoyed me. Imagine a stranger twanging one chord of your hoodie whenever you forget he's there. I rode past houses my buddy had circled on a map and jotted curbside impressions. Noise level, amount of shade, approximate distance to the nearest trolley stop, then steered east to see how the district bled into West Philly proper. Nutritional self-preservation soon insisted I find lunch before the next temperature spike. Citizens Bank Park lay maybe 10 minutes south, so I shot down Broad Street until the ballpark's green spine appeared above the stores. I found an air-conditioned burger joint half hidden behind a tangle of neon beer signs, parallel parked between a dented Camry and a florist's van, and slid into a vinyl booth still slick with sanitizer spray. That prickle hit the back of my neck again, sharper, almost electric. No overhead vent blew cold air, no hairpin inside my collar, and my t-shirt label had been scissored off months earlier. I set elbows on Formica and scanned. Young bar staff, shift managers, delivery guys, they all moved like people who belonged inside 90-degree July. The only thing that jarred was a man easing sideways behind me toward the takeout counter. He wore black slacks with permanent creases and a tuxedo jacket, the sort of formal wear you see at evening weddings or black-tie charity events, except he paired it with desert boots and no tie. The jacket looked too heavy for the climate, night or day. He gave off no aroma of sweat. When I traced the broad line of his shoulders toward his face, he tipped his chin as if acknowledging the glance and offered a thin, toothpaste commercial grin. Then he angled into the queue and out of my sightline. The lunch rush ebbed. I mopped ketchup with the last triangle of bun and refilled my water glass. The man in the tuxedo jacket had vanished, not just outside for a smoke or waiting by the condiment counter, but fully gone. Cups clacked, servers bustled, the door's bell jingled for a mother shepherding two tots. Yet I never glimpsed that dark jacket. Figuring he had ducked to the restroom, I ambled toward the cashier, paid, and on a whim asked the waitress ringing me up if she had noticed the formal-looking guy earlier. Her eyebrows knit, as though my question were a hard math problem. "No tuxes today, hon?" she said. "Too hot, somebody's pranking you." I shrugged, pushed through the glass door, and almost collided with the same man standing in the noon glare. He was parked in shadow thrown by the florist's van, hands buried in pockets. Seen closer, his jacket hung oddly, too loose across the chest, as though he wore plates or padding underneath. I laughed it off. "Slipped out before dessert?" He studied me a beat too long, eyes distant, and replied, "I saw something." Then he pivoted away, loafers scraping, and strode north, rounding the building with a speed that defeated conversation. When I jogged the corner to follow, he was gone. Swallowed by foot traffic or an alley. I told myself I needed caffeine and pointed the car back toward Upper Darby. The afternoon melted as slowly as chocolate on a dashboard. I finished rating the last address at 4:45. Daylight still hammered the asphalt, so instead of heading west along the turnpike, I killed time exploring those jigsaw streets behind 69th Street Terminal, block after block, where row houses, barbershops, Nigerian groceries, and storefront churches share the littered warble of trolley brakes. A pair of kids drag-raced bicycles past me, shrieking. A barber in sandals smoked on his stoop. Everyday city, except the prickle returned, meaner, lancing straight through cotton, pinning me between shoulder blades. Raise the windows, prickle remained. Crank the air full blast, same. I switched on music. A sax solo drowned in static. Nothing banished the sensation that I was no longer alone inside the car, or rather that someone paced me from just beyond the glass. I accelerated west and south, chasing narrower intersections. By then the sun sagged low enough to tint shadows violet. Philadelphia's heart fell behind me. Dense residential turned to small industrial, to bramble lots fenced in rust. Eventually I found myself circling the low stone wall of an old cemetery whose eastern boundary brushed a trolley spur. A patch of legal street parking lay vacant. I slid in, flipped the gear to park, shut the motor, and exhaled. The prickle faded the instant the engine's hum died. I set my head back and let the seat soak sweat. A church bell tolled the half-hour. Wind shifted through catalpa leaves. No prickling, no eyes boring holes, just wind. Night came on, flimsy and warm. I had no desire to battle weekend traffic on I-76, so I phoned my friend, told him his circled neighborhoods looked fine if he avoided one particular block where garbage piled higher than bumpers, and offered to swing downtown early next morning to scout rumored rental bargains. He agreed. Rather than waste a hotel fee, I decided to sleep in the car. I dozed through first cricket choirs, half dreaming of tuxedo fabric rustling. Then, near midnight, I jolted upright, every nerve awake. No obvious cause, headlights nowhere, road still empty, but the prickling returned, this time over my scalp, cresting hair. The cemetery's wrought iron pedestrian gate stood about 20 yards away under a warped sycamore. My windshield framed the tree and the arched stone portal. Between trunk and gate column a shape crouched, low, elongated, broad across shoulders. Moonlight bled around clouds and limned its back with mother of pearl. The profile reminded me of sculptures I had seen in natural history museums. Big cats frozen mid-prowl. A cougar, my mind supplied, though I had never seen one outside photos. A Great Dane, too lithe. Bear cub, the silhouette lacked bear hump or fat ruff. As if sensing the microscope of my stare, the animal creature lifted its head. The motion was graceful, a hinge unwinding. Pointed ears, a long muzzle. Yellow irises flashed, twin coins reflecting distant street lamp glow. Most dogs stare right through you, but these eyes calculated. They assessed distance, predicted outcomes, tested whether my softness could be peeled away. My heart beat so hard my seatbelt throbbed. Should I start the engine? Drive? As if hearing those unspoken verbs, the thing's lips peeled back. The rumble shook glass. A growl leaf deep, stone deep, a vibration older than houses or roads. My skin remembered on a prehistoric level that sounds like that meant end of bloodline. Fight response never surfaced. Flight shelved itself because a closed car door felt like cardboard. I simply watched, mouth slack, while the panther, if panther it was, held my gaze. Then it uncoiled and padded toward the gate. Each step landed noiseless on cracked pavement. At the bars it halted. The gate stood half open, padlock dangling. It could have slipped through. Instead, it rested one splayed paw on the hinge post and turned. A lamplit gust swept dust around its legs, modeling the coat so the beast flickered between black and camo shadow. With deliberate slowness, it laid its chin across the bar, closed eyes, and inhaled as though tasting the night. When the lids lifted again, pupils swallowed most of the yellow. It studied me one beat longer. I do not remember retrieving the ignition key. Suddenly, the engine coughed alive. Headlights lanced the dark, and reflex flattened my hand on the horn. That mindless shriek of steel startled even me. The creature jerked, muscle flashing. It did not sprint. It simply faded. One step, two, and the third step melted into blackness between stones. Gone. Honking still, I reversed so hard the bumper scraped brick, then fishtailed onto the cross street and roared northwest through stop signs until city lights multiplied and a cluster of late-night diners promised human witnesses. At an all-night Wawa near the river, I parked under sodium glow and walked loops around the building to verify nothing followed. Inside, I swallowed 3 coffees, straight, burning tongue, until the jitter replaced dread. A retired cop manned the overnight counter. At 2 a.m. no customers queued, so I asked, casual as possible, whether animal control ever fielded reports of large cats loose in Philly. He chuckled, wiped cappuccino froth off the nozzle, said he had handled calls for pit bulls and once for an escaped pet monkey wearing a diaper, but not for a tiger, if that's what you're hinting at. He was polite but bemused. I nodded, said maybe I had seen a huge alley tom in bad light. He replied, alley cats are rough but rarely bigger than microwave ovens. We both laughed, the polite laugh that closes conversations. I lay awake inside my sedan until violet dawn seeped over the Delaware. Prickle gone. Sunrise smeared pink across sandstone facades. I met my friend, toured apartments, ate cheesesteaks, performed every mundane task the city demanded. Nothing abnormal intruded. The tuxedoed man never resurfaced. No officer taped missing pet panther flyers to lampposts. Yet the creature's eyes lingered whenever I blinked, like overexposed film on retina. Back near the Mason-Dixon, I tried science. A wildlife management professor at a community college south of Gettysburg owed me a favor. I texted him, vague emergency, could I buy him coffee? When we met, I described in restrained terms a cat as long as a Great Dane, perched on city stonework. He laughed gently, citing habitat fragmentation, vehicle collisions, lack of genetic corridors, every reason a viable panther population could not survive inside Metro Philadelphia. When I pushed, could a single escaped exotic survive undetected? He shrugged. Impossible to feed in concrete canyons without someone uploading phone video. I emerged from that meeting intellectually convinced I had misread darkness and adrenaline, but conviction cannot bully away memory. Weeks later, a thought pinned me upright in bed. If I had hallucinated the entire apparition, what triggered the nape tingling before any visual contact? Why did the sensation cut off precisely when the creature disappeared? Why did I notice the tuxedoed man twice, once indoors where no feline could roam, each instance coinciding with that same eerie premonition? The memories lined up like coordinates, refusing tidy explanation. So what did I meet? I leafed through folklore. Lenni Lenape legends speak of spirit panthers guarding threshold places. European settlers recycled such tales into ghost cat sightings from Maine to Appalachia. Modern cryptozoology christened them ABCs, alien big cats, meaning felids seen where they have no right to exist, black leopards stalking English sheepfolds, jaguars prowling Swiss resorts, mountain lions haunting Staten Island. Whether any flesh and blood cat can cross oceans in secret remains debated in niche journals, but the acronym captures the unease. Alien because it doesn't belong, big because bigger is harder to dismiss, cat because feline grace conjures prehistoric ambush. I have replayed that Philadelphia night enough times to taste exhaust fumes anew. My current best explanations break down into four. First possibility, misidentification. A large feral dog with a slit coat could look feline in half light, but no dog's eyes glow canary yellow without direct shine, and no dog prowls with the shoulder-hip rhythm of a panther. Second, escaped pet. Maybe a melanistic leopard kept illegally in someone's basement. Stranger things happen. Yet all big cats smell, rank musk detectable 50 yards downwind. That night, my open window carried only the faint odor of mown grass and diesel. Third, hallucination born of fatigue, heat stroke, caffeine, and the earlier unsettling encounter with a man in unsuitable attire. I value rationality, yet the vividness, the coherence across sensory modalities seems too tight for dream logic. I felt the growl vibrate glass. My subconscious is not that tactile. Fourth option remains least marketable at academic conferences. Something else stalked that cemetery boundary. Something that can look pantherish, but is not bound by panther biology. A guardian or scavenger or sentinel by collective fears, glimpsed for centuries and slotted into whatever frame each era finds plausible. Today we call it an alien big cat. 200 years ago, colonists might have named it a devil. Lenape shamans a misnemequa. Label changes, presence endures. That fourth explanation would also clarify the tuxedoed stranger. Maybe watchers of thresholds travel in pairs. One visible in daylight crowds, drawing no more documentation than a shrug, the other slipping through moonlit margins, testing the courage of stray motorists. When I recall his smile, polished yet brittle, I sense an echo of the panther's appraisal, recognition not of who I was, but of what category I fit. Passing observer, safe to ignore once distance closed. I sometimes drive to Philly for concerts. Traffic at night detours past that same cemetery. Whenever I pause at the light opposite the iron gate, I feel for the razor prickle along my nape. Most evenings, nothing stirs. Twice it has returned. Once after a thunderstorm when the air smelled of cut copper. Once on a windless November dawn when brown leaves lay plastered to curbstones. Both times I kept my eyes fixed on the red signal until it turned green and I could speed away. I have not glanced toward the gate again. I maintain curiosity, not obsession. In glove compartment rests a small voice recorder. If I ever hear that subterranean growl while the recorder is rolling, I might capture proof to show the wildlife professor, though I suspect he would attribute unusual frequencies to mechanical distortion. I also keep a printed pamphlet from Pennsylvania's Game Commission listing hotline numbers for bear and cougar sightings. Its crease is almost worn through, but I never dial. As the waitress told me, too warm for tuxedos, too rational for phantoms, yet both apparently roam the city if one knows when to look. And so I watch. Alleys, bridge underpasses, warehouse margins where lamp bulbs blink out. Not because I yearn for another primal chill. Truthfully, I dread feeling that helpless again. But because seeing it once more under better light might prove my senses did not betray me. Until that verification arrives, memory remains the only footprint the creature left, and memories, like paw prints in dust, can blur the moment you try tracing them for a doubting audience. Back in the spring of 2015, I was working as the junior hand on a cow-calf operation in southern Alaska, a spread big enough that even the boss occasionally got turned around when he strayed from the main section. The home place lay on the flats not far from the highway, but one grazing lease, the one that figured in this business, sat nearly 10 miles beyond the last gravel spur. boxed in by federal forest on 3 sides and by muskeg on the 4th. The ground was rough. The road was more a pair of burned-in tire ruts than an honest track, and the only structures were a weather-silvered pole barn, a pair of mineral tubs, and a primitive salt shelter the owner's grandkids had hammered together years before. We kept a couple of 100 head of mixed black baldies and red Angus on that lease early every season. They stayed virtually feral until calving chores dragged us out there. So a ranch hand could lose half a day just creeping in with a pickup, walking